Well, hello, and thank you for coming to today's webinar, How to Pick Your Program, hosting a Community Scanning Day. My name is Biz Gallo. I'm the Statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator here at the Library of Michigan. And my job is to help cultural heritage organizations and libraries throughout the state to digitize their collections, to make them accessible, and to help preserve them over time. So this is the last webinar in the How to Pick series, which is our little bit more advanced series. It covers a variety of topics. We had classes that were on specific formats like digitizing newspapers and audiovisual material. We had resource-centered class like how to work with digitization vendors. And then we had procedural classes like writing digitization grant applications and creating digital exhibits. Now, we don't have any plans for additional digitization webinars, but I do want to encourage any and all of you that if you have specific digitization related topics that you'd like to learn more about, let me know, and I'm happy to continue to create programming around those. The rest of this advanced digitization webinar series is available on YouTube, and we'll share out a copy of the slides that has the link to that afterwards. Just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so you can access the content again later alongside the slides. The recording should be available next week, allowing time for captioning. So if you've missed this class or any of the other classes in the series, you can always view our recordings on the Library of Michigan's webinar archive. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat or to hold them till the end. I probably won't see them because I am without Becky today, as I said. And then if you have any technical or audio issues, please reach out to me in the chat. Becky won't be able to help, but I will do my best. Also, all the resources that I'm going to talk about today are included in the resource section of the slides, which you'll receive with your recording link. So feel free to sit back and relax and don't feel like you need to scribble down links or ask for those, because those will all be provided at the end. All right, so today we're going to be looking at planning and executing a Community Scanning Day project. And we're going to talk about the planning part, outreach, and then the implementation. But before we dive into that, I always like to start with a little poll. And again, this is going to be the fun part. I'd like to just get a sense from all of you, have you participated in a community scanning event, either as somebody who was running it or somebody who was participating, bringing material in to be scanned, and how to and how it went. So I'm going to launch this poll. Okay, so again, and then also if you want to drop in the chat something that really stood out to you about the event, whether it was something good or bad. Okay, it looks like most people have not participated in it, which is great because that's what we're here to learn about. See, Mary does a lot of scanning, but it's one patron rather than an event with, it seems like, multiple people coming. Heidi says that even if you think you're prepared for all the formats people might want to digitize, somebody will bring you something you didn't plan on. Exactly. And we are definitely going to talk about that. So, looks like most of you have not participated in one in any sense. So this is great. We're going to really dive into what's involved in it, how to prepare for it, and how to execute it. But there are definitely a handful of you who have done this before, so you can talk a little bit more about your experience. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be talking about soup to nuts, everything involved in these, what planning needs to go into a successful community scanning day. And I always like to start with planning. So what is a community scanning day? It's a really great opportunity to invite community members to come into your organization and to digitize and to hopefully share their keepsakes with your organization. There's many reasons that you might want to have a community scanning day at your institution. But why you do that, it's important to know ahead of time so that you can make sure to tailor your event to what your specific goals are for the event. So common goals for having a community scanning day might be to educate your community about a variety of topics. This could be, sharing about local history, talking to them about preservation or conservation, or even digital archiving. It could be to expand your own local history collection, and you could do this by growing it from contributions from your community. Sometimes you have a community scanning day where people just come in, scan it, and take their stuff, but sometimes they contribute their digital assets to your collection. Could be to build community relationships with individuals and organizations that are similar to yours, such as historical societies or museums, or even specific community members that have a lot of interests or background or experience in these areas. It could be to preserve important records. This could be whether it's important to just the history of your community or just the participant. The value of this doesn't necessarily have to be for the whole community. It could be important to just that one participant. It could be to share the past. Maybe you want to have an online portal or a digital archive and something you want to help share more information about your community. Last, it might be something to help develop collections around a particular place or event. So, we're 2 years out from the United States' semi-quincentennial, which is 250 years. So I know, at least in my circles, there's been a lot of collecting happening around this anniversary. So just think about, is there an anniversary or an event or a place that's local or specific to you that you might want to commemorate through a community? Now, again, this is a lot of goals. You may have one, you may have multiple goals, but it's important to identify what these goals are ahead of time so that you can make the most of your resources by not focusing too much on activities that don't either meet your goals or that you can help find community partners to fill those gaps. Like if there's community interest that doesn't fit your goals, maybe a different community member or partner could. Right. So now that you know what your goals are, you might need to do some education with the public around common reasons to digitize. So the two main reasons for digitization are for preservation and access. Now, in terms of preservation, consider that a lot of the materials that people may bring to community scanning days, those are oftentimes old, they may be fragile or deteriorating or obsolete. Examples of this might be glass plate negatives, letters on brittle paper, home movies on videotape. Now, these are all examples of materials that need to be digitized in order to preserve them for the future. Now, we know that the goal of any preservation action is to enable access. Preservation without access is just a waste of resources. So access in this instance could be to share it more easily with family, friends, or the community at large. But it could also be just enabling access for the participant themselves. Maybe if they have a home movie and the format is obsolete, they don't have playback equipment they could come into the library and or your organization and digitize that for better access. Now, when it comes time to not only host your community scanning day, but also to market it, you'll want to highlight these reasons so that community members will understand what a community scanning day is and why they would want to digitize their materials. Okay, so now that you know what your goals are, you're gonna want to look at some of these logistics before you can move forward. There's some really straightforward things like a location. You're gonna need to know where people should come. Now, this might be at your organization, or if you have a partner organization, it might be there. But wherever it is, you need to make sure that you have enough room so that you can set up a few tables, because it will be at minimum a few tables. But you might have a variety of stations, and we'll talk about those later. But you might need, as many as, or as few as 3 or more, depending on both the interest and the number of people that come, as well as your own resources. You'll need to decide on a date and time. Consider whether you're trying to get material for a special event or anniversary, like we talked about in the last section, you'll probably need to plan ahead so that you'll be able to get material ahead of time. You also want to give yourself like 3 to 5 hours at least to ensure that you have enough time to check in participants, to gather information, to actually digitize the material, and to give yourself a buffer for troubleshooting if anything happens. You'll need to develop an agenda or a schedule. This could be a basic scanning day where, people come in, they digitize materials and they leave, or it could be something a lot more robust where people come in, they digitize material, maybe they record a short oral history or a story of them talking about the piece that they brought in to digitize. So whatever it is, just make sure that you have an agenda so that people know what to expect. And in this agenda, not only for the participants, but for your staff, make sure that you build in some time for testing equipment so that you can troubleshoot if you need to, and that you're set up for success. A community scanning day is a really great way to bring in more community members and to bring them together. So this could be a really good opportunity to do some outreach and to collaborate with local historical societies or museums. Maybe there's a community group that you could partner with, or even high school clubs. I know a lot of interest has been around incorporating high school history clubs or trying to develop those in partnership with libraries. So this is another really good example of that. And these partners don't necessarily have to participate in the event. They could just help by marketing the event. They could be sharing it on their social media channels. Maybe they actually want to handle the technical side and they want to do more of the digitization. Maybe they have something that they want to do an educational program on, and this is a really good collaboration opportunity so that they could come and have an interested and willing audience, and that everyone can take something away from. But whatever you do, trying to build these relationships ahead of time so you know who to go to as soon as you think that you might start planning one of these. It's really going to help increase the efficacy of your event. Whether you have community volunteers or your own staff, you'll probably need to recruit additional volunteers. There are at minimum 3 stations. You will need at least 1 staff per station, though I would highly recommend more, not only to help with the number of people that you may have coming in, but to also give people a little break, depending on how long your program is. And now that you have all these sorts of things laid out, you'll need to make sure that you build in time for training of your staff and volunteer on their roles, record keeping or organization, and how to work the equipment itself. And depending on the equipment you use, the digitization equipment can have a pretty steep learning curve. So you don't want to be trying to figure this out the day of. This is definitely something you want to plan for in your organization. And we'll talk about different equipment a little bit later. All right, so now that you have your logistics in place, your big picture, you'll need to get down to specifics. And in order to do that, you need to ensure that you have the right equipment and materials to do so. And whether you're using a flatbed scanner or a digital camera or a tablet, you need to make sure that you have a table with enough room for not only the equipment, but also a computer and the material that's going to be digitized so that nothing is crowded. Like, you're going to want to make sure that you have elbow room and really 1 table per setup. Next, you're going to want to ensure that the area you're using is near a power outlet if possible, between the digitization equipment, laptops, monitors, anything else that you might have. You're going to need outlets, but you also want to avoid a lot of extension cords because they can be a tripping hazard and they can be dangerous not only to participants, but also the material. Seats. It might seem silly to note, but depending on where your event is, you may have to bring extra chairs with you for people to sit if it's not at your location. And not just like one seat at each station, but you'll need a seat for the participant and either the staff or the volunteer. People will probably wait and stick around to either talk about their stories or wait for a friend. So you'll want some additional seats as well. When it comes to digital, you'll definitely need a way to share the files. So think about flash drives or some other storage material or media. And this is a good consideration is like, is this something that you want to provide to participants? Is this something that it's like bring your own storage? And whatever it is, just make sure that people know ahead of time so that they don't come and then not have something to be able to take their digital files back with them. Thinking about the material that people bring in, some should probably be handled with extra care. For example, like photographic materials such as prints, slides, or negatives should be handled while wearing nitrile or latex gloves. This is going to avoid transferring the oil from your fingers to the material. Now, that isn't to say that material that people bring in should be dirty or dusty or moldy. Like these are not good examples of material that people should bring in that you might otherwise want to use nitrile gloves or masks or personal protection equipment. This is really just from a preservation aspect. Obviously, you're going to need your digitization equipment. We'll talk a little bit later about the different options that you might be able to use and which might be best for you. But aside from the actual equipment, you might need some accessories like cables, cords, power strips, adapters for slides. Just make sure that whatever you need, you kind of get ahead of time and maybe even create an inventory list so you know what to set up. Now, unless you have a permanent digitization setup, you're probably going to be using a laptop because they're easily transportable. I would like to say that even though it's not necessary, sometimes having an additional monitor or mouse or a USB hub can make a laptop's workstation a lot more useful and user-friendly for people. So I would recommend not only thinking about the laptop to bring, but some of the accessories. Again, last but not least, you'll need to acquire the expertise. So whether you already know how to use the equipment or you need to train partners and volunteers, just make sure that everybody feels comfortable before people start walking through the door. Okay, we've talked a little bit about logistics and the physical setup, but when it comes to digital projects or digitization projects like this, you'll really need to consider the digital organization of the event. So decide ahead of time who's going to get a copy of the files and how. This kind of goes back to the earlier comment about flash drives. Is it something that you're going to hand out? Do you need to make sure that they bring them ahead of time? Are you getting a copy of the files, or are you going to need to digitize directly to their device, delete them? Hopefully you are getting a copy of the files that you can share with your community or your local history archive. And you'll not only get an access copy, but a preservation copy. You'll want to talk to them about whether or not the participants want a access or a preservation copy. A lot of times people will only want the access copy, and it's good to know that you have the preservation file that's then going to be preserved. Also, kind of consider how you're going to organize the files. You will probably have many people attend, and so in order to keep them all straight, you're going to want to set a file naming and folder nesting schema ahead of time, and that way you don't run into dozens of files with like image 01, image 02, image 03 for the file name and no idea who goes with what. So I recommend making a folder for each participant or give them a reference ID or something that links them to that folder. And then you can always assign file names based on either their last name or some reference ID. That way you're streamlining file management, you're organizing it, and you're able to have that intellectual control over these files that will match them to their digitized items. If you are going to be keeping a copy of these files, think about whether or not you want these to be part of your organization's digital collections, or are these going to be a separate digital collection or exhibit? Is this something that, you are just going to be, local history, and then you'll have this, or is this going to be more of a community collection where maybe you'll highlight them, but it won't actually be part of your collection for the long-term preservation? Also, I kind of talked about maybe recording some supplementary material, like oral history of the participant talking about the item they brought to digitize. Think about, one, if you're going to do that, how are you recording it? How are you naming those files? How are you saving them, managing them? Just kind of be aware of that. And it's probably going to be different for every organization, but just make sure that whatever you do, you have it written down so that you can refer back to it and you can make sure that everybody's on the same page. Okay. So now that we've laid the groundwork for our event, we need to make sure that people show up and that they actually bring stuff with them. So let's take a look at outreach. We all know that outreach is an essential component to any program, but especially for community scanning days. And this is because participants need to prepare ahead of time to identify and bring materials to digitize with them. So thinking about the earlier slides where we talked about the goals for this event, this is a great time to think about the stories you want to tell about your community or from your community. Consider the diversity of your community and think about ways to represent that in your digital collections. Being inclusive in your outreach might mean translating materials into other languages, having a strong social media presence, or even drafting personal emails to your target audiences. And depending on where your target audience is, you might find one or more of these methods of communications is best. But emails and listservs are a great way to get the word out. And if you're not already on the My Local History listserv, I would highly recommend subscribing to it because there's a lot of great information that's passed along there related to local history in Michigan. Obviously, you can think about promoting in your newsletters or social media, not only in your own organizations, but any partner organizations or similarly aligned organizations. Same thing with your programming calendar. It doesn't only have to be on your calendar. It might not even be in calendars that are partnering on the specific event. You might just have organizations or interest groups in your area that have similar interests, and you can share it on theirs as well. So aside from the specifics of the event, like the date and time, you're going to want to make sure that people know ahead of time that they need to bring material with them. And you're going to want to include some guidance or examples in your marketing materials to ensure that, one, people have enough time to unearth their photo album or keepsake drawer. I think we all have sentimental or important items that are kept safe in a very safe place, if only we could remember where it was exactly. And two, that people have enough time to go through the material before they get to the event. You do not want people to pull out an album and start reminiscing about every picture and event from their life. We want that step to happen before they get to the event so that they come in ready to share their selected items. Now, things that people should consider when they're selecting materials are, is this something that is unique? How much would it cost to replace? How meaningful is it? And who else has copies? So, it might seem obvious to some of us who work with collections, but we really want to encourage the participants to think critically about what materials to bring and what would benefit most from digital access. And this can be kind of a difficult message to send through marketing materials, but by giving examples of good items for selection, you can really help them narrow it down. Last, you are going to want to limit the amount of materials that participants can bring. The number of items is going to depend on your own organization's capacity, your equipment, your time, and your community's interest. But by being really proactive about limiting the number of items each person can bring, you're making sure that you'll have enough time to work with each participant and that nobody's left out. If you don't know where to start, 3 items is usually a pretty good rule of thumb. So what kind of material should they be bringing? Obviously we're really focused on unique materials. So you could encourage people to bring photographs, letters, and slides. You could possibly have them bring in scrapbooks if that's something that you, one, feel like you can handle with your equipment. But two, you also can handle from kind of an intellectual control perspective. I would not consider a scrapbook as one item that is quite large. Wouldn't consider a book or a diary as one item either. I would consider each scan an item for this. So just kind of think about how you are conveying that item information and what examples you're giving. Things to leave at home would be commercial material. People might come in with their favorite record that they want to digitize, or a movie that's on beta and they can't get it on DVD and they're really sad about it. But that is a whole other can of worms that we do not want to open. These are usually mass produced and readily available in other formats, so this is not a good use for a community scanning day. Other materials that people might want to leave at home are fragile material, not only because you could damage it in the digitization, but it could be damaged even when they bring it in. So you want to make sure that if people are bringing that they are aware of, kind of the risks involved. You might also offer to, depending on your program and your resources, you may be able to lend equipment to people with some fragile material so that they could bring it to their home, digitize it at home, and then bring the equipment back. I know I have pulled out items from tucked away places and find that they are either moldy or dusty or dirty, or even have some new furry friends. Definitely avoid bringing those items into a community scanning day. They can cause health problems. They can spread infestation to other people's stuff. So we really want to make sure that the material that people are bringing, even if it's old, is in a good enough condition that it can be safely digitized and that it's not going to impact other people. Last, if there are certain formats that your team won't have the ability to digitize, such as audiovisual material, three-dimensional objects, stuff like that, suggest that people leave these at home. Or if you get a lot of input from people saying that they have these things and they would like to digitize them, you can always plan a separate event or point them to other resources. So again, if you have the capability of digitizing things, be clear in your marketing material the types of items that you are prepared to digitize and the types of items that you are not prepared to digitize, so that people don't get upset when they come and you can't digitize their home movies. You also have to be mindful of your own limitations in terms of equipment, expertise, time, and personnel resources. Okay. Before we talk about rights, I have to make my disclaimer that I am not a lawyer, and the research and resources here are for your informational purposes only and not for the purposes of providing legal advice. You should contact your attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular issue or problem. Claire would be very proud of me. I am not going to talk about copyright or intellectual property rights in great detail, but it's definitely something to consider when you digitize anything, whether it's for your own institution or for a partner. So ideally, the materials that the participants bring with them to scan, ideally they are their own property, not just the physical property, but their intellectual property. Remember that intellectual property and physical property are not the same thing. Your library owns a book, but your library does not own the copyright to that book. So copyright, as a refresher, is the type of intellectual property law that protects original works of authorship from being used or duplicated without the creator's permission. These can be a literary work, an artistic work, computer code, they can be visual, they can be literary, it can be anything, as long as it's original and it's affixed. Copyright will apply to both published and unpublished materials. And though US copyright law can be a little bit difficult to decipher, there are many resources on determining the copyright status of a work. And I have a whole section on that in the resource guide, so you can check that out. It's something to consider though, because a lot of the material that you will see at a community scanning day is likely going to be unpublished material, may or may not have a known creator or a known creation date. So you might have to do a little bit more investigation to be able to determine something's copyright status. So if you're going to keep a copy of the digital files from this event, you're going to want to be sure to record, store, and share that rights holder information at the time of scanning. Don't think that you're going to get to this information later, because you won't. Identify what the copyright status is if possible. For an event like this, it's likely going to be either in copyright or no copyright US, which is also public domain. If it is still in copyright and the participant is the copyright holder, you should get a release from the participant, and I'll talk about releases in the next section. So anytime you host materials online, you're going to want to have a forward-facing takedown policy that tells users what to do if they believe that their intellectual property material has been improperly shared online. So you're going to want to have your forward-facing takedown policy, and then you're going to want to have your internal policy that tells your staff how you handle these takedown requests. And that way you're consistent, you have a policy, and you have a little bit more protection from litigation if it comes down to that. As with all things, each organization is going to need to determine its own comfort level of risk management, and there is always some level of risk management when it comes to digitization. So not only do we have to consider rights with digital collections, but we have to consider, or should be considering, privacy. Digital access can be a double-edged sword. And while it's great that once hidden material can now be brought up with the speed of a Google search, now once hidden material can be brought up with the speed of a Google search. The benefits of the searchable, accessible document in a digital collection is counterweighed by the ability to search for information that might cause harm. Now, there are some legal restrictions to providing access to some material due to privacy. For example, content may provide sensitive or private information like social security numbers or health records. Now, there are laws that protect against providing access to PII, or personally identifiable information. This is any information that permits the identity of an individual to be directly or indirectly inferred. In libraries, we're pretty comfortable with protecting patron privacy. There's some similar issues at play here. This could be information about a person's education, their employment history, social security or driver's license numbers, birth dates, and more. But there's also laws protecting against health or financial information being shared. So you're going to want to screen anything that you do digitize. And hopefully when you have only a few per person, that'll be a little bit easier to do. But there might not always be laws that dictate how we have to handle materials that we scan. Something to consider is that the subject just might be really embarrassing for an individual. So just kind of be aware of this, especially with the internet's ability to share things fast, broadly, and forever. Okay, so quick recap. When you're reaching out to participants, you're going to want to highlight the limitations on the number, the format, the condition, and the rights of the items. And even if you provide guidance on all of these things ahead of time, be sure to keep an eye out for things like these that might come in on the day. You'll have a lot of opportunities to screen items. You'll be interviewing participants, gathering information. So you'll take this time to do the best you can to ensure that the materials fit within your agreed upon parameters. Okay, we have things planned. The participant showed up with materials, and it's now time to host our community scanning day. We talked a little bit about tables ahead of time, but I would highly recommend that you have different stations for the various activities. This will not only help participants navigate their way through a probably new process for them, but it will also keep things moving. You could have signs or some wayfinding help for each station to get from one station to the next. And when people arrive, you'll want them to come to a check-in table. This is where you'll gather participant information, and that will stay with them as you create file names and folders to organize their digital records. You can also take this opportunity to have participants sign releases. This will save you time and also make sure that you take care of all the nitty-gritty things ahead of time. Next, they can move on to the interview or description table, and this is where people will talk about the items that they've brought to be scanned. You will not only get some background on the items themselves, but you can record specific information like metadata that will help not only make the digitized versions more discoverable, but also provide context that only the participant can provide, because they know what is, who is in those pictures, they know when it was taken and where it was taken and why it's important. So you want to take the time to have those interviews. And again, you're also screening here for some of the, privacy or rights restricted information. Once you have a good sense of that, people can move on to the digitization table. Depending on the equipment you use, this could be very fast or it could take some time. You'll likely need to do some setting adjustments based on the format and size of the material that each people bring. So you might want to consider having a cheat sheet for the people running that station so that they can quickly set file resolutions and other settings to be correct for that material. So that's kind of the bulk of the main tables or stations that you should have set up or could have set up. But that doesn't mean you have to stop there. You could have some optional or additional stations where participants can share a story about the item they brought. They might want to record this. And we talked about the oral history of the material, even if it's just a short little snippet. It could also be something that you put on social media to market or highlight future Community Scanning Day events. If you have partner tables, you might want to provide them with their own table so that they have an opportunity to recruit members, to share information about their organization. Your own staff or staff from your own institution could highlight additional or future programming that you have going on. You might also find this is a really good opportunity to have a tangential educational opportunity. So maybe you can have somebody come in and talk about, photo conservation or digital preservation or storage options, something that's related that you can, kind of do little bite-size educational outreach to. You could have more. Be creative. It really is up to you and your own resources. You'll notice that's a theme, that these events will look very different from library to library or organization to organization, because you're all going to be working with different resources, different communities. And I would just also add that you may have one of just the main three, or you may have multiples of all of these because you maybe have a lot of space and a really active partner group and community that wants to be involved in this. There isn't a right answer or a wrong answer. There's just what's going to work out best for you. So we mentioned having each station have its own dedicated person or people to help the event run smoothly. It's really great if the welcome staff at the registration or check-in table can kind of give people an overview of the process, get the essential information, and let them know what what the whole process is going to be, including, an estimate of time, because people like to know about how much time it's going to take. Aside from the welcome staff, you should have somebody dedicated to interviewing or gathering metadata about these items, and a person who's dedicated to scanning or photographing these. You may also have separate activity facilitators for the additional centers or the additional stations, like the oral history or the educational programs. So along with dedicated staff at each station, I would recommend having a coordinator to kind of float or check in on stations to help troubleshoot, answer questions, and maybe to help guide participants from one station to the next. These roles may rotate depending on how long your event is and how many people you have on hand to help. But by having a coordinator, you can check in to make sure that people aren't getting overwhelmed or getting tired, that they get a chance to get up and stretch, and that they still feel energized. So before the participants get started, you're going to want them to sign a release form. You're going to want to have them sign a release form for any program that they come to, but you know, especially if you're taking photographs. But the release form for the registration can also help make sure that they understand what's involved with the whole process. So not only that they may be photographed, that whether or not they're going to be providing you a copy of the files, like this would be a really good time to incorporate the digital rights to those materials so that they're only signing one document, or they have one form that they're checking boxes to indicate like, yes, you can do this, or no, you can't take the files, or whatever it is. And I have some examples in the resource guide that I'll share that you can take and apply to your own organization and what you need. If you are going to be keeping a copy of the files, or you are planning to provide access to the digitized files, definitely have a digital release for those materials included in the forms or the release form so that you can go exactly to that. So you might think that this is a lot. It will take a lot of time to fill out these forms and to gather all this information, but really that's a good thing. This is not going to be a really fast process. This is going to be an opportunity for you to sit down and communicate with members of your community, to get to know them, talk about your own organization. And you can also set the pace, because digitization isn't really all that fast. We know, for those of us who have digitized things, that, you know, creating the metadata takes a lot of time. Depending on what you're digitizing, it could take several minutes to scan a single item. So you're going to really want to take the time to sit down and talk to your contributors as you scan the items. So aside from the participant registration and releases, you're going to want to gather and give some additional information. This helps not only establish the intellectual control of the material, but will also help the person tell the item's story or their own story. You'll have to decide how and where you're going to record this information. Is it going to be on paper? Are you keeping a spreadsheet? Is there an online form? Honestly, do whatever works best for you, but whatever you do, make sure that you're consistent, that you can share it with people either through the process or digitally, and that you capture the necessary information about the items that the people have brought. So things that you're going to want to capture are, you know, obviously the name of the participant, which you'll have in their initial registration form, a given title of the item, if you have that, or a title that they want to give. You want to record its format and some descriptive information like the dates, names, places, you know, who created it, if they didn't, stuff like that. And then you'll also want to continue that interview process by gathering some additional context for the story, or context for that item or the story behind the item. This will really help build those community archives and help people really feel like they are represented. And if possible, to assign rights status or rights information for that material. You may or may not have that. You may or may not be able to determine that based on the information that they provide, but it's a good thing to record. Things that you're going to want to give to them as a reference number and or file naming convention. This could be something that they could come back to later on if they decide that, you know, no, I no longer want to share my records with people. That way they can track down the files, and you can address that at the time. Also, you can explain to them whatever file naming convention you came up with or assigned to their scans. And that way they know what they're looking at when they go through it. I'm going to talk briefly about some equipment options. Obviously, by the time people are showing up, you've had these all set up ahead of time. You've picked what you want, and you have them in place, but I just want to go and talk quickly about those. So pros and cons of each of these. We have scanners, we have digital cameras, and we have tablets or smartphones. So Flatbed scanners are great. They are easy to use, easy to transport. They're affordable. It's a pretty fast setup for scanning. It's usually, you have an interface that you can select your scanning settings on, and then you can also capture both reflective and transmissive materials like photographic slides or negatives. So these are great, all around pretty easy to use. That being said, they are a fixed size. So if something doesn't fit on the scanning platen, then it's not going to be in the scan. Depending on the model you get, it might not be good for bound material like diaries or yearbooks, scrapbooks, stuff like that. This puts pressure on the binding. They're also not great for fragile or not flat items. They could be damaged by putting pressure on them with the scanner lid. And they can also be a lot slower to capture than using something like a digital camera. Depending on your resolution, it could take a long time, like especially if you end up using a slide adapter. It can take several minutes to scan one of those based on the really high resolution needed to capture the image. I do just want to mention that the Library of Michigan does have digitization kits for both flatbed and book edge models. These can be used for really any purpose, but if you have a community scanning day and you want some additional equipment so that you can have more machines available, that's definitely a good use for these. I will include a link to the digitization kit page so you can check out more information about them, but they're a free resource. They ship to you for free. They come with a scanner, a laptop, and all of the accessories. So it's a really great resource if you need some additional hardware on a scanning day. Let's look at digital cameras. These are great because they're versatile. They can capture pretty much anything, 2D objects, 3D objects, reflective, transmissive. They can do pretty much anything. They are really fast. It is a click of a button once you have things set up, and they can capture really high resolution and detail. The cons, they are expensive. They, not only the cameras themselves, but you can't, or really just can't get a camera. You have to get all of the accessories that go with it in order to have a setup like a tripod or a copy stand, light sources, all of those sorts of things. So the initial investment is high, but they're really versatile. So it kind of depends on what your needs are. They also have a pretty steep learning curve when it comes to the expertise needed to use them, not only for the camera operation, but to make sure that you have the right setup. Also environmentally, other light sources or wall colors can have an impact on material digitized with a digital camera. So you just want to be aware of your entire environment if you're using this. I will say that for the public libraries out there, there was that ARPA grant that many libraries got a couple years ago. And I know that the programming kit that came with that came with a digital camera that you may already have and might not think about using it for a community scanning day, but that is an option. Last thing is tablets. You may already have these on hand. They're pretty easy to use and they have decent image quality. Cons, they're less consistent than the other options. They're less intuitive file organization, so you can lose things. They have fewer settings. And you, like the digital camera, you need a lot of the other accessories in order to make it useful. This, for me, would not be a choice to go with, but again, if that is what you have, it will work fine. Okay, we're wrapping up. I did want to just mention that digital preservation is key. As good stewards of these items, we want to make sure that the participants can also continue to steward these items now that they have them digitally. They're probably not going to get too much into digital preservation, but an easy mnemonic for them to remember is the 3-2-1 rule. That means like keeping 3 copies of your files on 2 different storage media, one of which being off-site. So if they have it in the cloud, in a flash drive, and you have one at the library or your organization, then they're all set. It can also easily share it with other people to, around the country to have that geographic distribution. Okay, you did it. You've successfully undertaken a community scanning day. Now what? Obviously, the goal of this event is to increase access to your community's history and encourage participants to continue to save and share their records. This is a really good opportunity for you to provide more resources and platforms for sharing out the digital versions of their items from your community scanning day. Thinking about sharing those out. If you have your own digital collections already that you can share on, that's awesome. If you don't, the Library of Michigan does have our own digital hosting platform based on ContentID, which is free and available to anyone to use. I will include the information for that in the slides. You can also just post it on social media, like not only pictures of the events, but you can pair that with some of the recorded oral histories about the material or the digitized material itself. You can use it in newsletters to promote both your organization and the event. If it went well, you're going to want to continue to promote it, not only at your organization, but with your partner organizations to continue to encourage people to share their collections. And as always, make sure you have a takedown policy if you have material online. All right, I know this is a lot. Just remember, to decide on your goals for the event beforehand, to reach out to potential partners to be sure you get buy-in and you have support from your community, to promote the event to your community and to let people know what they can bring or leave behind beforehand, to prepare equipment and staff, not only the equipment, but also so that people know how to use it, and to gather the information about the items so that you can continue to provide context and make them discoverable. All right, thank you. What questions do people have? Oh, Mary asks what I mean by a takedown policy. Yes, of course. So a takedown policy is a policy that you would have where people could say, I don't want this online anymore. And the reason that they might do that is because perhaps they are the intellectual property owner of that material and it was being provided against their wishes. So of course, copyright is protecting their intellectual property. When you have a takedown policy, you're going to want to request a few things from the person. You're going to want an identifier. So that's what, we talked about the reference ID or file names, or even just a title. I'm not sure a title or a URL, something like that. So they'll provide that and what their relation is. You can't just go online and say, I think you should take this down because I think it's violating copyright. They would have to be either the copyright holder or acting on behalf of the copyright holder. So they would provide that information, like what their relation is to the material, why, what the specific material is, and then you and their contact information so that you have a way of getting back to them. So that's the forward facing. Internally, you're going to want to have your own policy for how you would handle those requests. Like, do you take something down while you are investigating the takedown request, or do you leave it up? How long do you have to respond to it? How do you handle these if you do end up taking them down? And this doesn't just have to be for rights information, like for copyright infringement. It could be privacy. It could be other kind of more ethical reasons for taking material down. So I can always send out some specific examples for how to do that. The University of Michigan has some really good policy examples on their website, which will also be included in the resources. I hope that answered your question. So Chris asks, is there anything like MARC that provides a standardized organizing principle for digitized materials? Assuming that there isn't, do you know of any systems that state and who? Oh, okay. So when it comes to digitized materials like this, Dublin Core is a really great metadata schema for describing digitized materials. It's specific for, excuse me, digitized materials. It has 15 fields, from title, description, creator, all of those sorts of things. And there are crosswalks between MARC and Dublin Core and some other schemas. So I can include some examples of metadata schemas. And I also have in the resources an example metadata template. I should have mentioned if people wanted to use that so that they don't have to start from scratch. Oh, Chris responded that they are specifically talking about file, folder structures, naming conventions, etc. I can point you toward some really good resources on file and folder name structures. Just kind of thinking about them now, you're going to want them to be alphanumeric, human and machine readable. So, this is not the place to put really descriptive information in your file names, not like John Smith wearing a blue hat in front of, Tiger Stadium. It would be, like Smith and then underscore the date, or Smith and underscore, your organization, or something that kind of is coded that you can go back to your metadata record so that you can get the descriptive information there. You're also going to want it to be sortable. So you're going to want to use things like date structures and ISO formats. So, year, month, date, rather than January, January 1st, 2024, it would be 2024-0101. But yes, I will also, I will add that to the resources. For those of you who are kind of new to this, the Digitization Basics webinar series kind of goes into a lot of the nitty gritty of, organizing your files. So I'll include links to that series as well. Okay, if there are no more questions, I do just want to add 2 more notes. Now that this series is done, there are still other ways to learn about digitization. We just launched the Digitization Basics pathway in Niche Academy. For those of you who are familiar with it, Niche Academy is free to people in Michigan through the Library of Michigan, and it's a 5-course series on digitization, including Introduction to Digitization, Scope and Selection, Metadata and Access, Digital Capture and QC, and Digital Preservation. And for those of you who did the earlier webinar series, this takes that information and makes it more interactive. So I highly encourage you to check it out. And then last, I just wanted to thank you all for joining me. I know we're a few minutes over, and I appreciate you sticking around. I do want to say thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this presentation possible. And I really look forward to hearing how your community scanning days go. Thanks.